Morning, welcome to this training workshop on the major issue of carbon. My name's Andrew Wilson. I work for the Supply Chain Sustainability School. It's a pleasure to host this workshop and take you through the learning content. In a couple of minutes, I'm going to introduce our lead consultant, James Cadman, who's going to be delivering this workshop for us this morning. We've got Stefania as well as part of our team who's hosting the workshop and recording it for those who can't join. And I'm sure James will be making his slides available following the workshop as well. So whilst I'm sure you're going to be scribbling a lot of notes and participating as much as you can, don't feel you've got to capture everything because the slides will be available as a PDF straight after the workshop. What it's about, this workshop today is part of the RDP programme that the Supply Chain School is delivering in close association with Highways England. So Highways England RDP is the Regional Delivery Partnership, a major framework over the next 5 years to improve many of the country's major highways and road infrastructure. So it's a £8.7 billion framework, and the prime contractors who've been selected to deliver the schemes on this framework are working very closely with Highways England and the school to provide sustainability support to the full supply chain. So we're talking about all of these subcontractors, suppliers and manufacturers who are involved in any part of any scheme connected with the Regional Delivery Partnership being part of this discrete programme of training and support that's being delivered through the school, both via our online platform and in sessions such as this, not just this year, but well into the future as well. So the prime contractors involved, many of you will be familiar with them. You'll be representing these companies yourself, or they'll be part of your customers, I'm sure. Osborne, Volker Fitzpatrick, Graham, Galliford Try, Costain, Balfour Beatty, Skanska, Kia, BAM, MMCN and Vinci. So they are 11 of the 13 major delivery integration partners who are collaborating with us and funding this programme of support for your benefit. So the programme itself consists of sessions such as this, as well as a whole world of online learning via the school's platform, which I'm sure many of you are familiar with. And if you're not, I'd encourage you to spend some time looking through what the school has to offer online. There's over 2,500 individual learning resources connected across all different aspects of sustainability through the school's platform. Indeed, there's so much now that we've started creating and curating specific learning pathways to provide an ideal introduction into some of the sustainability issues that we cover through our online platform. And a significant part of the RDP has actually been creating some learning pathways dedicated to the Highways England supply chain. So we've got training sessions such as this, as I've said. We've got online learning, the learning pathways. The third major element of the RDP is the sustainability tool. We've created a tool to measure and monitor and track sustainability performance, and we are about to go live with the sustainability tool. Many of you will have participated in some training that we've been delivering over the last few weeks, and we've got other sessions coming up before we go live with the tool and provide everybody with their own logins to use the tool and measure and input their data, so we can measure sustainability performance across the entire Highways England RDP supply chain. So we're very excited about everything that we're doing with Highways England. This workshop is a perfect way to start because it deals with carbon, which is core to everything that the school does in terms of its work to mitigate and reduce the environmental impact of the construction industry and its supply chains. I'll stop rambling now. I'm going to pass across to James Cadman. Morning, James.
Hi, everyone.
Hi. James is our senior consultant within the supply chain school, and one of his specialist areas is carbon. So ideal person to be leading the workshop this morning. If you do have any questions, I'm sure James can answer those as we go along, or we'll leave time towards the end of the workshop to deal with those. And James will take you through the other kind of housekeeping and how we're going to organise the learning for you this morning. But remains for me to say, enjoy the workshop. Thanks for being part of this programme. Any general questions about what we're doing with Highways England, please get in touch with either myself or Stefania, who, as I say, is part of our team and doing all of the administrative work and support work in the background, as well as leading our work on the tool. So James, over to you. Thanks very much for being with us this morning, and enjoy the training, everybody, and have a good day. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Andrew. Okay, so straight into it. I'm going to share my screen in a second. Just get it all up and running. So hopefully you can now see the screen that says Introduction to Climate Change and Carbon Footprinting. Yes. Thank you very much. Thanks, Steph. Thanks for coming along, everybody. Thanks for making time. We've got 3 hours from now till about 12:30 with an interactive workshop on carbon and climate change. Before that, I just want to go briefly around the virtual room so I know who's here and everybody else knows who's here. So very briefly, because we've got nearly 20 people on the call, very briefly, your name, your role, and how much you think you know about climate change and carbon from 0 to 10, where 0 is, I know nothing, that's exactly why I'm here, James, what a stupid question, up to 10, which is, I know everything and I work for the IPCC. You get where I'm coming from. So I'm going to go down the list as I can see it on my screen. Apologies if I pronounce your name wrong, I'll try my best. I'm going to go in alphabetical order, so I'm going to start with Alice, please.
Hi, yes, I'm Alice Saskevich. I'm a sustainability intern at Severfield. I feel I'm probably in a 9, but I do have a background in geography, so.
Cool, thanks, Alice. So if I get any tricky questions, I'll come to you. Yeah, you can answer them for me. Ashley. You're on mute, Ashley.
Somebody was going to do it, so it had to be me. I got it out of the way early. I'm head of sustainability at Ward, which is a materials management company, and I would say I probably think I'm about 6. I think there's probably lots more for me to learn, and I like to keep myself refreshed.
Cool. Thanks, Ashley. Nancy.
Nancy Austin, Bauer Technologies, and I would say about a 3.
Cool, thanks, Nancy. Mariam.
Hi, Mariam Bashai, Senior Quality Analyst, and I would say I'm about 4.
Cool, thanks, Mariam. You realise if we're doing this in real life, I'd get you all lining up on a big, like, against the wall, 0 to 10, so you've got off light here. Chris McCulloch.
Sales, but in charge of sort of product development for Dawn and Low geotextiles. I would say I'm a 1 at the moment. Very limited knowledge on these things. So
right place, Chris.
Exactly that. That's exactly why I'm here.
Cool, thanks. Dan Donovan.
Hi, my name is Dan Donovan from Paul Mulcair UK Limited. I'm the company accountant there, and I would have very limited as well, maybe 2 or 3.
Cool, thanks, Dan. Fatima.
Hi, my name is Fatima. I'm a civil engineer from Shemortag, and I think we'll be 7. I'm going around for a while. I met you already in London on a workshop, so yeah, 7.
Cool, thanks, Fatima. Excellent. Gigi.
Hi everyone, Gigi here from Hanson UK Major Projects team, and I would say 3, 4, something like that.
Cool, thank you. Lisa?
Hi, Lisa Marrick from Highways England. I would say 0.
Excellent. Thank you for your honesty. That's always good to see. Mark Thackeray.
Hi, good morning, everybody. I'm Mark Thackeray of Floor Limited. We're one of the partners on the SMP Alliance. I'm the HSWE and C, CB and Carbon partner representative for Floor on the Smart Motorways Programme Alliance. I was drawn into HSE by the S, increasingly got interested in the H. The E's always been the sort of the poor relation until recently. Personal interest in matters environmental, and at present I'd probably put myself about a 4 or 5.
Excellent, thanks Mark. Let's say I'm impressed with how many letters you've got in your title. That's wonderful. You're slowly gathering up the alphabet. Wonderful. Nicola Doughton.
Hi, Quality Assurance Director at Hercules. To be honest, I'd probably go for about a 3, although I should be a bit higher really, but I'm definitely not. So looking forward to this.
Cool, thank you. Patience. You're on mute, Patience.
Environmental Advisor, Galliford Try, and I'd probably say 6, but I need a refresh.
Cool, thank you. Thank you for coming. We've got Paul.
Good morning, everybody. Paul Thompson from Saint-Gobain. We're a UK manufacturer of access cover solutions and drainage systems for both the RDP and the Smart Motorways programme. I would say 5/6 for our own product, but probably a 3 or a 4 in understanding the customer's wider requirements.
Yeah, interesting differentiation. Thanks, Paul. Cool. That'll come into the discussions a bit later. Steve Purcell-Herbert.
Good morning. Yeah, Steve Purcell-Herbert, Highways England. Given the breadth and depth of this subject, probably about a 2, if I'm totally honest.
Cool. Thanks, Steve. Rob Eagles.
Hi, good morning, everyone. Yeah, Rob Eagles. I'm the Regional Engineering Manager for MGF. I'd say probably 1 or 2 as well.
Cool. Thanks, Rob. Other Rob, Robert Delahunt. You there, Robert? Can't hear him at the moment. Okay, so we'll go to Steve Usher.
Yes, Steve Usher, the Logistics Manager for Hatton Traffic Management. On the vehicle side, probably 5 to 6, but in the other areas, probably around about 2.
Okay, that's cool. Excellent, and good to make that differentiation between different aspects as well. That's cool. Paul Thompson.
Yeah, I've already spoken.
Oh, sorry.
Are there 2 Pauls?
Oh, you've come up. Yeah, you've come up twice. That's
sorry.
Right. Sorry, no worries. And Adele. You there, Adele?
Hi, sorry about that. Yes, I'm Adele Travis. I'm an environmental advisor with A1+. I would say I've been out the industry for a little while, so I'd say about 4 to 5.
Okay, great. Thank you, everybody. That's really good for me to know. And there's a good spread, and that's fairly typical in these kind of workshops where we get about 20 people. There's a good spread of kind of experiences and knowledge, and some of it's in particular areas, and rather than the whole piece. The way I like to do these things, I think, is really good, is to go right back to first principles so that nobody's left behind. Everybody's got a good basic understanding of where this all comes from, why we're dealing with it, and then the application of it. How do we put measures in place to deal with it? And some of it will be new to you, some of it won't be. So hopefully for those who do know it already, it'll be good as a refresher, or you can contribute to the conversation as well. But as I say, it's kind of, we want to make sure that everybody's on the same page, nobody gets left behind in the process that we do. Okay, cool. So let me just make sure I've got this right. What we're going to do is a quick explanation of the workshop overview. We're going to talk about climate change. Where does it come from? What is the science behind climate change? And then move into, well, what can we actually do about it? What are the actions that we can take to mitigate and adapt to climate change? Part of which is, how do we do carbon footprinting? How do we measure the carbon impact of the things that we do the products we manufacture. And within that, the data, the numbers that are necessary, the resources we need to be able to do those calculations. And there'll be lots of guidance on the resources, on the tools and databases that you can access, many of which are free. I want to stress that there are things that you can pay for, but there are many sources of information that are free. And again, there's a whole long list of information within the slide deck, so don't worry about copying down hugely long internet web links, because you'll get those in the slides later. And then we'll finish off with a brief look at what carbon reduction planning is all about, which is kind of how you put the strategy in place to reduce your emissions. Before we do that, I want to go to the first Menti poll. So if I get the right screen up. So if you go to your phones or your other browser, I can see some people have already putting some words in. You've got 3 options within Menti, 3 words or 3 phrases. I think there's a character limit, so you can put in, a short phrase rather than just a word. Just to remind you, if you're struggling to get in, it's menti.com. Don't put in mentimeter.com because you go to a slightly different website. And then you need the password of 51 26 63 3. And we're asking, what are the words that come to your mind when you think of climate change and carbon? And so far we're getting environment, greenhouse gases, sea levels, animals, yeah, biodiversity, extreme weather, net zero carbon, ozone depletion is an interesting one, sustainability, yeah, urgent, yeah, that's important. We have time, but not excessive amounts of time. Footprints, definitely. Impact. What else are we getting here? Farming, yeah, it's not just about the construction sector, definitely. Dangerous warming, cool. And as you probably realise, this is one of those things that the more times people type in the same word, the bigger the word appears on the screen. So environment, impact, sustainability, yeah. Wildlife extinction, yeah, that's great, that's really good. I'm assuming that 15C means 1.5C, forestry and farming. No, that's cool. Excellent. Thank you, everybody. We'll capture these as well that we can share with yourselves, but also with Highways England about, what are those key topics that come to mind. And it's worth bearing this in mind when we go through it, that one of the key phrases, or one of the key things I'm going to come out with several times, you'll probably get tired of me saying it, is that carbon is really important, but we shouldn't lose sight of all the other impacts as well that we have through what we do, what we manufacture, what we install, and what we use. They're all related, whether it's air quality, whether it's biodiversity, whether it's social implications of how people work and live as well. So cool. Thank you very much for that. We shall save that. Going back to the slides with the workshop overview. By the end of the workshop, we want you to be more aware of the drivers for reducing carbon. Why are we doing it? What's forcing us to do it? And there's many different drivers as to why we should be doing it. We want you to be able to explain what a carbon footprint is and how you build one, how you go about understanding and creating a carbon footprint of your organisation or your product or the project that you're working on. And also to be able to do that, to be able to identify the sources of data that you need in your organisation and from your suppliers to help you build that footprint and the carbon reduction plans that go with it. So that's the aim. Cool. So right back to first principles. Hopefully you can see a picture of the Earth centred on Northern America, Greenland, and you can just see the UK on the right hand side there. Right back to first principles. What is the greenhouse gas effect? What's driving all of this? On the left-hand side, you've got the natural greenhouse gas effect, and this is a perfectly normal process. Without it, the Earth would be too cold for us to live. As it happens, the natural greenhouse gas means that on average, the Earth's temperature is about 15 degrees Celsius on average overall. Clearly, it's colder in the north and warmer in the tropics and the equator, but on average, it's about 15C, which means we have liquid water. It means we can live. And what allows us to do that is the atmosphere of... Could I just ask people to go on mute if you're able to? Thanks. If you need to ask me a question, do unmute and do shout out by all means. Thank you. Our Earth's atmosphere creates a blanket. It's a bit like a duvet. It traps in the Earth's the heat that comes in from the sun. Radiation comes in, it bounces off the Earth, turns into infrared radiation. That's what warms up the atmosphere and keeps it habitable for us. Some of that heat gets radiated out to space, it gets reflected out. The problem with the greenhouse gas effect is that we're pumping more of these gases into the atmosphere, and we're making that duvet thicker. Effectively, it's like going from a summer duvet to a winter duvet. We're trapping more heat in, less of it is escaping to space, and consequently the global average temperature is going up. That's the greenhouse gas effect. As I say, it's a perfectly natural phenomenon, but we're just kind of exacerbating it with what we're doing. You probably remember vaguely the water cycle from geography at school. There's a carbon cycle. It's the same idea. Carbon goes round. Some of it takes ages and ages and ages. Those are the ones in blue. Some of it is kind of hourly or daily. Those are the ones in red. And there's an exchange of carbon dioxide all the time from plants, from animals, from the oceans. The ocean absorbs a huge amount of carbon dioxide. About a quarter of all our emissions that we make get absorbed, get dissolved into the Earth's oceans. But we are affecting two of those quite clearly. And again, we're accelerating and exacerbating how those happen. So burning fossil fuels, fuels that have been in the ground for millennia are being dug up and burnt, essentially. And land deforestation and land use change for agriculture and other reasons. Those fluxes, those changes in CO2 are happening more quickly than they would normally without our input. Again, they're kind of normal. They do happen, but we're making them happen more quickly than you would normally find. And what does this mean? You're going to see quite a few graphs from me. I'm a bit of a sucker for a graph. A picture does speak 1,000 words. What this picture is telling us is the concentration of carbon dioxide in the Earth's atmosphere for the last 800,000 years. And this data has been gathered from ice cores that have been dug out of Antarctica. They drill down, they pull out an ice core, and they can do some very clever measurements to understand how much CO2 was in the Earth's atmosphere at a given time. They do some clever analysis, and they produce a graph that looks like this ultimately. And what you can see going up the left-hand side is the concentration of CO2 in the Earth's atmosphere. Parts per million is just a fancy way of saying for every million molecules that are floating around in a given space, about 300 of them are CO2. So not very many, a very low proportion is CO2, but it's the most important gas when it comes to what we're doing to the Earth's climate. So you can see small changes make a big difference. And then as you go through the years from 800,000 years ago up to the present day, you can see there's been a natural flux up and down, fairly regular over geological timescales. And you can see that it's reached a high point of about 300 ppm and lower points of around 150, 170 parts per million. And when it's lower, you get ice ages, it's colder. When it's higher, you get warmer periods. So naturally, it fluctuates up and down between warm periods and cool periods. And this is affected by all kinds of natural phenomena that all have different cycles. So the Earth warming and cooling is natural. But you can see on the right-hand end, and the dates are there for a reason, that we have affected that within the last couple of hundred years. And it ties in with the Industrial Revolution, essentially, when that started, and we started to, on a large scale, burn coal and then more recently oil and gas and other sources of fossil fuels. We've driven up that increase far beyond what is normal over the last million years or so in terms of CO2 concentrations. It's well over 400 ppm now. The concentration when I last looked at it was 415 parts per million, and it's going up, essentially. It keeps going up. And just to put some context on when we appeared as a species, that red line shows that it was about 300,000 years ago. So it's definitely something that we're causing. It's not a natural phenomenon. What does that mean for the Earth's temperature? If you remember a few minutes ago, I said the average global temperature is about 15 degrees Celsius for the whole globe. But overall, it has gone up by about 1.1 degrees Celsius over the last couple of hundred years, 150 years. And that is tied in with the CO2 concentration levels as well. They do match each other. We can make a significant link scientifically between the CO2 concentration and the human-induced warming that we see going on. I had to catch my breath a couple of weeks ago. I was reading a book that was published in the year 2000, so not that long ago, and the change in temperature was only about 0.5 degree Celsius then. So back in 2000, the Earth's atmosphere had only warmed up by 0.5 degree. In the last 20 years, it's gone up by another 0.5 degree. So it is happening, and it's happening quickly. So that's the kind of science bit. What does that mean in terms of what we see with our eyes and what we see on the news? I'm sure these pictures are familiar. Shrinking glaciers, bleaching coral reefs, forest fires in Australia, which do happen. Let me stress, these are normal events, but they're happening more frequently and more extremely than normal. Fires north of the Arctic Circle, hurricanes in the Caribbean. The one in the bottom middle of the picture is the reservoir that feeds Johannesburg in South Africa. They had a huge drought a couple of years ago, an extreme drought, far beyond what they normally have, to the point where they were really stressed for drinking water, and they were very close to a really serious emergency situation for drinking water. And then in the UK, we see more frequent flooding events, more frequent storms. I mean, how often do we hear about storm this and storm that on the weather these days? So these events are getting more frequent. The way it's explained is that climate change is a multiplier. It takes existing weather patterns and makes them more extreme and happen more frequently. And I'd like to make the distinction there between weather and climate as well. The weather is what we see out of our window every day. For me, it's nice and sunny and a bit breezy today. Climate is what happens over a longer period. It's a trend over 30 or more years. So we're seeing a trend and a change over time. We shouldn't get complacent about this. The recent severely cold weather in Texas that we've seen on the news, you might say, well, that's clearly climate change isn't happening because it's freezing cold there. They've got extremely cold winter. There are studies out there that show that the effects of climate change have made the weather in the Arctic more unstable. And because of that, it's affecting weather further south. Essentially, the polar vortex is wobbling and it's making cold weather come down as far as Texas, which you wouldn't normally see. So it is having these effects, these adverse effects. So, question to all of you. What gases cause climate change? There's 6 of them. I've given you 3 already. Is anyone going to shout out some climate change gases for us and where they come from? Any volunteers?
Nitrous oxide.
Excellent. Where does that come from?
My educated or uneducated guess would be burning fossil petrol and diesels.
Exactly. If you burn anything, if you burn any fossil fuel in particular, it'll give off carbon dioxide. It's just a combustion process. If you burn petrol, diesel, gas, oil, coal, you'll get carbon dioxide. You'll get other stuff as well. You'll get local air quality pollutants and healthcare problems, but you'll get CO2. Excellent. Thank you. Thank you, Jan. Anyone else? Any
Methane.
other? Excellent.
Methane.
And where does that come from? Thank you for that.
Animals.
Excellent. You've seen my slides already. It comes out of both ends, by the way. Without getting too graphic, it's mainly from the front end, actually. Their digestion system causes so much methane. It's sheep as well, which is why when you've probably seen on TV people saying we should have a less meat-rich diet, it's because of that, because there's a huge amount of energy that goes into rearing the cattle, but also in terms of the way their digestive system works. Any other sources that we might get from methane that are prevalent? One of the other ones that's really important is composting, anaerobic digestion. So all waste products, if you have a process that has any waste material that rots down, that can give off lots of CO2. So anyone who works in the water sector and wastewater in particular, you get there's a high risk of methane, and you need to deal with that. Okay, it gets a little bit harder now. Any others?
Nitrous oxide.
Excellent. You've seen my slides as well. Nitrous oxide, where does that come from?
Agricultural, is it?
Yep. Nitrous oxide comes from many sources. One is agriculture. You get rotting down of animal wastes. Ammonia can go to nitrous oxide. Again, it comes in the wastewater treatment process. Nitrous oxide is also known as laughing gas. If you've been in maternity hospital, you might have heard of it being called Entonox. So it's, clearly it has anesthetic properties, which is great, but it has a huge impact on the climate as well. It's also used as a propellant gas, or it used to be used as a propellant gas. So that's why I've put the squirty cream on the slide. Starbucks used to use it for their squirty cream. So when we were allowed to go into a Starbucks and you could get a fancy coffee with squirty cream on the top, they used to use that until they realized when they did their footprint that one of the biggest sources of their climate change impact was from squirty cream, because the squirty cream was propelled out of the can by nitrous oxide. And then that gas just goes into the atmosphere. So they changed that very quickly. Okay, any other guesses? We've got 3 more.
Sulfur hexafluoride.
Excellent. There you go. Sulfur hexafluoride. would you like to suggest where that's used?
I think electrical insulation.
Yeah, it's used in switchgear and electrical insulation. Sulfur hexafluoride is a wonderful chemical. It's not toxic to us. It doesn't burn, which means it's great as an insulating gas when you've got high voltage switchgear and a risk of flammability. It doesn't dissolve in water. Problem is, it's really, really bad for the climate. And we didn't know this, of course, when we first invented it and used it. And of course, because it's been used so much, it's commercially very available and cheap as well. But it's something that needs to be dealt with. So National Grid and other organisations such as them are really looking at how they can move to something that's not sulfur hexafluoride. Okay, and there's a couple more groups here that I'll just push through onto. Hydrofluorocarbons and perfluorocarbons. If any of you have worked with air conditioning, heating and ventilation, you'll know those kind of compounds. They're the liquids that are used in our air conditioning systems, essentially. Again, like sulfur hexafluoride, they're really good at what they do. They've got great properties for cooling or warming. They're not toxic, they're not flammable, they're wonderful. But, and there's always a but, they are really bad for the climate. A bit like CFCs were 20 odd years ago. CFCs were great at doing that same job until we realised that they knacker the ozone layer. And then we've got, oh, we need to do something different, because we didn't realise at the time that they, despite all those great properties down on the ground, they have other issues elsewhere. Why have we focused on these six? That's because of the Kyoto Protocol that happened 20 odd years ago now, and they focused on the six main gases that cause climate change. There are others, there are many others, but these are the main six in terms of their prevalence of use and how much is actually emitted. And it's these that we focus on when we talk about reducing our impact on climate change. You might have heard of 2 degrees or even 1.5 degrees. The idea is that we want to reduce that global warming to no more than 2 degrees above pre-industrial levels. Actually, now we're looking at 1.5 degrees. So if you remember, I said a few minutes ago that the Earth's atmosphere has warmed by about 1 degree already. We're trying to limit that to no more than 1.5 degrees in total. So that headroom is quite small in terms of how much we can actually allow the Earth to warm any further. The scale of the challenge in the UK, there's a law that you probably have heard of called the Climate Change Act. It's been around for a few years now. It was updated in 2019. Essentially, it says that we want to become, as a country, net zero by 2050. And what you can see on this graph is the path to that net zero. So on the left-hand side, you can see how many tons of carbon dioxide we as a country are emitting each year. And in 1990, that was somewhere up to at around 900 million tons of carbon dioxide per year. That has steadily come down to about 500, so not quite half, but not far off it. And then we've got that trajectory and that kind of dashed purple line to come down to net zero by 2050 in terms of what we produce ourselves in the UK in terms of our own emissions. And there's an organisation called the Committee for Climate Change that's a government body that works and advises the government on what we need to do as a country to reduce that. And they come up with carbon budgets. You can see it says CB 1, 2, 3, 4 and so on. They've just published CB 6 just before Christmas. And this is what we need to do as a country. And you've probably seen news about how we're going to decarbonise the industries that we work in, how we're going to decarbonise the housing sector, aviation, all these big sectors, manufacturing, construction, obviously, to reach net zero. So these are high level plans. What can we do to tackle them? So yes, the Climate Change Act has a target of 100% reduction to net zero by 2050. There's a slight variation in Scotland and Wales. Scotland because they have more natural renewable energy to hand than the rest of the UK on average, and Wales is slightly different because they're very much more focused on farming in terms of their economy. But essentially we're looking at net zero by 2050. Okay. And in terms of why we've done so well over the last 20, 30 years, a big reason for that has been decarbonising the UK's electricity grid. So this is National Grid and all the power companies that work together. And what this wonderful graph is showing us is how carbon intensive our electricity is. So that's any time you plug anything in to the wall, whether it's at home or at work, if you plug it in and you draw electricity from the grid, you're taking something that has inherently got carbon embedded in it. It's kind of embodied carbon from the manufacture of that electricity at a power station somewhere. Back in 1990, for every kilowatt hour, that's a unit of energy, an amount of energy. For every kilowatt hour of energy that you consumed, there were 900 grams of carbon dioxide emitted in the production of that electricity. So someone somewhere has burnt some coal or some oil, they've made the electricity, they've put it down a pylon, and it's come out of the plug and into your device. But it's dropped. It's dropped by 2/3 since 1990, which is great. But what are the reasons for that? Back in the 90s, we had the dash for gas. We moved steadily away from coal-fired power stations to gas, which is less carbon intensive. It's still a fossil fuel, but it's less carbon intensive. So that brought the numbers down. Of course, we've got nuclear in the mix as well. That's kind of very much been a kind of a stable bedrock to our energy production. Actually, it's gone down, if anything, in terms of nuclear power production at the moment. They're making more. And then more recently, we've had a huge investment in renewable energy, solar panels, wind turbines, other sources of energy, biomass boilers as well. Some very small scale, on people's houses, others larger scale out in the North Sea, but they've all cumulatively added to the grid, and that's brought the number down again. So we're somewhere around it's probably about now 250 grams of carbon dioxide emitted for every kilowatt hour of energy produced. So we've rapidly decarbonised our grid. So it's kind of been done for us. The power companies, government regulators, Ofgem, and National Grid as well, have done a lot of this good stuff for us when it comes to electricity. And obviously those of us who've invested in renewables in our own facilities as well have contributed to that. Just looking back to last summer when we went into first lockdown 1, and it was bright and sunny and we're all sat outside working from home and kind of what the hell's going on. We had many days when we didn't use coal at all in the grid, and that brought the number down even further to about 140 grams of carbon per kilowatt hour produced, using all that renewable energy. Clearly that doesn't work in winter quite as well, and it doesn't work if you're in the north of Scotland compared to the south of England, but it just gives us an insight into what can be done in terms of if we invest correctly in renewables, we can really bring those numbers down through grid energy. Okay. On a global scale, you might well have heard of the Paris Climate Change Agreement. Every year, countries get together and they call it the Conference of Parties, COP, to talk about climate change. What we're going to do about it, how we're going to tackle it. So they meet every year. The next one is going to be in Glasgow this November, COP26, first 2 weeks of November. So it's really important that we as the UK kind of really stamp our mark on this. But this one back in 2015 in Paris was a landmark COP because it actually made some change. We actually got agreement from all countries pretty much that we're going to do something about this. Every country said, yep, we're going to make an effort, we're going to participate. That's why they were so happy about it. Even countries like Syria signed up to it eventually. And if Syria realized that there's a problem with climate change, it's serious. The US has come back in since the change in president in the US. Whatever your political persuasion, they're now back in. Biden, I think that was one of the first things he signed, an executive order to put the US back in. Just as an aside, in the US, they're doing stuff at state level anyway. California and other states are doing loads of stuff anyway, despite what the government does overall. But in 2016, this was ratified, and we now have a situation where each country has a nationally determined contribution, an NDC. It's one of the many acronyms about how much each country is going to do to contribute its bit to tackling climate change. So it's landmark. It's not legally binding, but it's pretty good. And this is filtering through. There's the UK's Climate Change Act. There's things like COP and Paris Climate Change Agreement that are driving lots of companies to say, yeah, we need to have a target on climate neutrality. And you'll see loads of reports about this, and I'm sure many of your organisations have thought about or are in the process of making a claim and a statement and talking about net zero targets. Whether it's carbon neutrality or net zero, it's important that organisations are thinking in that respect. Bringing it closer to home, within the construction sector, there's been a document since the early 2010s, I think it is, about how we can reduce in our sector our greenhouse gas emissions. And one of the key targets in that was a 50% reduction by 2025 against a 1990 baseline. So that's something that's taken it and distilled it into what we as a sector are doing and how we can drive forward, because construction is pretty fundamental to everything that we in society do, but it has its own challenges, like any other sector does. So if you haven't read that document, it's a good source of information. And similarly in infrastructure, there's a key report that came out in 2013, so we're talking 8 years ago now. It's in the process of being reviewed and updated. The Construction Leadership Council is updating this report, the Infrastructure Carbon Review. And again, it's talking about the scale of the issue, and very relevant for Highways England, of course. Some of the key headlines. Sorry, I'm getting some noise. If you go on mute, that'd be really helpful. Thank you. One of the key things that came out of it was that the level of emissions that the infrastructure sector can control and manage were given in that one picture. It's a good report, but some of the fundamental things that come out of it is that over half of the emissions are associated with infrastructure in some shape or form, whether that's roads, rail, water, airports, and so on. There's a big amount of the UK's emissions that are relevant to infrastructure, much of which we can control directly, and the rest of it we can influence as well. When we talk about roads, we can control how we manufacture and install those roads and all the systems with them, and then through those systems we can influence how people use those roads, working with various people in the value chain. But the key thing that came out of that was 4 words. If you reduce carbon, you can reduce costs. That's slightly more than 4 words, but you know what I mean. Reduce carbon, reduce costs. And it's directly linked. And there are so many examples out there, particularly in the water sector, actually, about how organisations have looked at cost reduction through the lens of carbon. If you use carbon as one of your decision-making tools, along with quality, delivery, price, efficacy, and all those good things that you should be doing anyway, if carbon is one of those decision points as well, it can help you focus in on what the best opportunity is, what the best solution is, and reduce carbon along the way as well. Commercial buildings have a similar situation in terms of reducing the energy that we have, that we consume in them. What this picture is showing you is that over a 50-year lifetime of operating a building, and it would be relevant for an asset as well, you've got an amount of embodied carbon. That's the carbon that's locked away in those materials. So from manufacturing the concrete, the steel, the plasterboard, the glass, and so on, that's been emitted in a factory somewhere, or even on site, and it's locked away. That's the very light blue at the bottom of the graph. And then you can see the bits at the top, which is the operation of the facility. So the dark blue is the lighting, and then you've got heating and ventilation and cooling in the kind of the greens and the reds. What this picture is telling us is that as we get more and more efficient with running our facilities, we get more efficient lighting, we get more efficient HVAC and so on, which is good. The embodied carbon of manufacturing and installing those assets and those buildings becomes ever more significant. So we shouldn't lose sight of what goes into manufacturing and building and constructing an asset. We need to look at the whole life of the product or the asset as well. It's not just the in-use phase. And what does this mean for us? Well, this is an example from the Cooperative Bank. They looked at carbon very much from the beginning when they were designing and constructing their new offices up in Greater Manchester. They talked about all sorts of different operations and all sorts of different opportunities to reduce carbon. And I'm not going to read them all out, but you can see them there, that they've got natural lighting, natural ventilation. They thought about energy efficient equipment. Where does the power come from? So they've got CHP. All kinds of different opportunities to reduce the energy use in manufacture construction, but also in operation as well. And you can see they looked at BREEAM as well, and how much carbon they can reduce in terms of operation and use through that process. Sadly, I haven't been able to find an outcome report. What have they actually done compared to predicted, but I'm sure they're operating it well. But what this says for me overall is that there's no one solution. There's no kind of magic silver bullet. It's not like the CFCs I talked about earlier for ozone depletion, where they just said get rid of CFCs and use something different. For carbon, there's lots of opportunities out there and lots of alternatives that we can put in place to address the problem. Okay, just take a quick Zip. So even with all that, there's still a question of why should we do this? What's actually driving us to do this? Some of you will be captured by reporting legislation. You'll have to report on carbon because your organisation is large enough that you're covered under the streamlined energy and carbon regulations. Essentially, if you're not an SME, basically, if you're bigger than an SME, you'll be captured by the SECR. But there's some more kind of, softer reasons as well. It's reputation, it's winning new work, it's identifying opportunities to reduce your consumption of materials, your consumption of direct energy, and therefore carbon as well, and inherently save money. If you have shareholders, stakeholders, there's that implication as well with reputations. So there's a lot of reasons why we should be looking at carbon. It's not just about saving the planet. Clearly that's in there. It's also about being a sustainable business and winning more work and driving forward the agenda for a more efficient and leaner way of working. And I mentioned lean specifically because a lot of these activities directly feed into that kind of Kaizen way of thinking, being leaner with what we do, being more efficient, being circular in how we use our materials. These things all link together. They are not discrete. So what can we actually do about it? We've had the doom and gloom. We've had the pictures of coral reefs bleaching. Let's be positive. What can we do about it? We're coming out of lockdown. It's time to be positive. We can obviously do renewable energy. If we have the ability to either buy renewable energy or even install our own capacity, great, go for it. Think about it. It's an option. We can use more efficient equipment. I'm sure you recognise the green to red kind of banding for efficient equipment. That's normally around white goods and cars and other appliances, but it's that kind of mindset that if you're more efficient, you can reduce the cost as well. We need to adapt as well. There's definitely an aspect here of adapting to what's already out there. The Thames flood barrier, built decades ago, was put there to manage excessive water coming up the Thames, high tides and so on. That's climate change adaptation in many senses. Mangroves are the natural version of that. Biodiversity, using nature to help mitigate and adapt to what we're doing. More efficient equipment, clearly. The light bulbs are a great example. On the left, you've got the old tungsten filament ones that were about 10% light and 90% heat, great for warming your hands up. And then we moved to CFLs in the middle, compact fluorescents, which were great, but had their side effects and issues because they have a small amount of mercury in them, so that's always a bit of a problem. And now most people are moving to LEDs on the right-hand side, a lot more efficient with their energy and don't have quite the same disposal issues of a CFL. And ultimately, we can look at very high-tech solutions to actively take carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere. That diagram is a picture of a carbon capture and storage plant, ways of actively removing carbon dioxide from the atmosphere. So not just about emitting less, but actively taking out what's already there from the atmosphere. There's dozens of different things we can do. And again, when you get the slides later, have a look at these and you'll say, well, that's not relevant to us, but that's something we could do something about. And this is just a small snapshot of the kinds of things you can look at to actively think about carbon along with all your other business practices as well. So clearly the equipment and transport you use can be more efficient, especially if it directly uses a fossil fuel. Can you move to a Euro 6? If you're using plant and equipment, can you move to stage 5, NRMM? Can you move to electric vehicles? Think about different options. Hydrogen, the hydrogen economy is on the horizon. It's coming very soon, powering our homes, powering some of our larger vehicles. And if that hydrogen has been produced in a green way, then it's the way to go for some of that higher end equipment. Green travel plans. Clearly the last 12 months or so, 11 months, we've been doing a lot more home working, teleworking. Think about those options as well as traveling. Think about the materials as well. This is where the embodied carbon piece comes in. So again, just to reiterate, the embodied carbon is the energy that's used in manufacturing a product. So it's kind of locked away in that product. It also links to being more efficient with the materials we use. Don't waste so much. Be leaner and keener with the materials that we buy and order. Make sure that we think about alternative materials that are lower in carbon in some shape or form. They might have recycled content. They might have been reused. They might be just a fundamentally different material than what we normally use. So they have a lower carbon impact. So thinking about carbon when we decide what we're going to build and how we're going to design it is another way of looking at our impacts. We need to remember as well the behavioural piece as well. It's all very well buying the most efficient piece of kit, but if people don't know how to use it or how to install it, we're going to lose a lot of the gains that we make. So thinking about eco modes in plant and equipment, automatic switches and timers in assets and facilities and buildings, thinking about using different forms of energy on site, whether it's battery powered, solar panels, we've even got micro CHP listed there as well. And there's many different ways of doing this, as I keep saying. And the one I just want to pick out here is alternatives to diesel. I'm sure many of you have heard of HVO as an alternative diesel fuel, hydrogenated vegetable oil. It's not a solution, but it's a stepping stone on the route to being more carbon efficient, and in this case, more air quality beneficial as well in terms of local air quality impacts. So as I say, there's a whole range of different options out there to think about, and building those into a business plan, into a design strategy is definitely the way to go. If you're going to design out carbon, clearly do it from the start. So one of the key phrases I want to get across is mitigation and adaptation. These are phrases that are used in climate change and carbon all the time. They kind of do what they say on the tin. Mitigation is about emitting less, is about being more efficient and not making so much carbon in the first place. And you can see there's a range of different options there. Adaptation is about saying and admitting there's a lot of climate change already happening. There's more in the pipeline that will happen, that will come through. So we need to adapt to a changing weather and a changing climate. The Thames flood barrier was one of those examples. There's some in the middle. You know, it's not just a, you know, there is a Venn diagram, they do overlap, some are in the middle, but thinking about all these different kind of options as well, and both mitigation and adaptation is important. And as I say, linking it to other things as well, we talk about local economy as well, building in local resilience and community impact as well. You might well have heard of the waste hierarchy. There's an energy hierarchy, unsurprisingly, and it follows the same kind of philosophy. If you can avoid using energy, don't. That's the Cooperative Bank example, having the natural light, the natural ventilation, rather than building in an HVAC kit specifically for that. They thought, well, if we can get away without using one, why not? Let's design it so we can use natural lighting and heating. But of course, inevitably, we will have to use energy at some point. So where we do, let's be efficient with how we do it. Let's use less overall through smarter design, the equipment that we use, and people's behaviours clearly as well, too, so we can reduce the amount that we do have to use. Then if we have the option to switch away from the grid or from fossil fuels into lower carbon alternatives, renewable alternatives, if there's opportunity to use solar panels, then great. There are so many examples out there, particularly in plant and equipment, where there are more and more options available now for battery powered, some with solar panels. So particularly lighting towers you can get with solar panels that are very useful, particularly in the longer summer days and spring days. And then finally, when you've done all of these things, which is kind of a carbon strategy laid out here, when you've done all of these things, then you can think about, well, what have we got left over that we just can't reduce any further? Then you can think about offsetting and dealing with those carbon emissions, but only once you've gone through everything possible to reduce what you have. Okay, we're going to hop back onto Menti, and I'm going to ask you a question. Where are you going to take action to reduce your carbon emissions? Think about your business. Think about your, so let's just hop on to Menti. The next one. Yeah, where will you take action to reduce your carbon emissions? Thinking of your own personal role, but also the organisation you work for, the kinds of things that you do. What actions will you take to reduce your emissions? Think of some of the ones that I was just showing you a few minutes ago. For those of you who need to use the code again on Menti, it's 51 26 63 3. Still the same web link, of course. So we've got transport there. That's good. Supply chain involvement, yeah, that's a really, really good one there. This is not something we can solve on our own. We need to work with our supply chain partners, both up and down the supply chain. Manufacturing, yep, EVs, travel less and transport. I think if anything that the pandemic has shown us is that we can actually work a lot more remotely than we thought we could. More video calls, local employment, lots of supply chain again, that's really good. Waste reduction, being more efficient, yep. Being lean. Switch to green energy, switch to electric cars, yep. All good stuff. So these are the kinds of things that are really good to put in a carbon reduction strategy. So, you know, a client comes to you and says, how are you reducing your carbon? What's your target for reducing carbon and being net zero? These are the kind of things that would go into the mix for what you can actively do. And it's understanding what your hotspots are. Where are those key aspects where you can actively reduce your carbon? Do you use a lot of transport and delivery and logistics? If so, then that's probably where your hotspot is. And then you think about, well, what can you do? Do you have control over your logistics or not? Or can you influence your third-party provider for logistics? Excellent. Okay, really good. We'll capture those, as I said earlier, and keep those and share them later. Okay. So the question that I often get is, well, how do you compare? How do I know that this is less carbon than that? Why is steel worse than concrete? Why are bricks bad for carbon? How do I know what to choose that's better? So it's always this apples and pears issue. How do you compare? And this is fundamentally what carbon footprinting is about. It's about building a currency, in effect, that you can compare different things. And how do you compare that one with that one in terms of carbon? So this is kind of where we're getting to with carbon footprinting, the ability to understand which is better or worse through some calculations. So we're going to play a bit of a game, a couple of questions on which is better, which is worse. And again, we're going to use Mentimeter in a minute to get your answers. So would one of you care to give me a response here? Which is better for carbon, in your opinion, traveling by train or by airplane for the same distance?
Train.
Definitely, thank you. That wasn't a booby trap at all. It was definitely train. But the question is by how much? So if we just hop back onto Menti, I'm just going to put the question over. So the question is, in percentage terms, how much better is traveling by train compared to plane for the same distance? How much less carbon is emitted for the same distance? Is it 10% less carbon for the same distance, 40, 80 or 95? And the reason we're doing this is a bit of a, you know, a kind of funny example, but the reason we're doing this is so you can get that understanding of how you can use carbon as a way of saying, well, which one is actually more efficient? And then you bring that into your decision-making process, along with price, along with the time that it takes you to, in this case, do the journey. The availability of tickets, all these kinds of things that go into your decision when you say to yourself, shall I travel by train or plane? It shouldn't just be about price. It should be about a few other things as well. Okay, so we've got 17 answers between 40, 80 and 95. Okay, excellent. Thank you for that. I'm just going to click and show. The right answer was 80%. It is 80% better for carbon for that same distance. And I'll show you the reason why. I'll just back to there. So this is a journey I did myself when I did one of these carbon workshops in Glasgow a couple of years ago when we were allowed to travel. I looked at the various impacts and the prices for traveling up from where I live up to Glasgow by train or by plane. And you can see the information on there. As it happened, the train ticket was cheaper at that point than the flight. Normally it's the other way around, of course. But in effect, there wasn't much difference between the cost. The time difference was not too dissimilar. If anything, it was probably more relaxing to go by train than by flying, and you get more time to yourself to work or to read a book, whatever. But importantly, on the carbon, it was far less. It was 80% less carbon for me traveling by train or by plane, makes a big difference. Clearly that doesn't work if you're flying to the US or to Australia, but within the UK that works, and the same applies to Northern Europe as well. Okay, the next one, same idea, different question. Which is better for carbon, a plastic bag on the left or a cotton bag on the right? And here they're the same size, they're the same volume. So which one's better for carbon?
Cotton bag.
Which one, sorry?
The cotton bag?
The cotton bag.
Cotton.
Plastic bag.
It's the plastic bag, yeah. The cotton bag is slightly deceptive. It says green on the cotton bag. That's a bit unfair of me. Whereas the Tesco's bag's all crumpled and has obviously been used a few times. No, actually, the cotton bag is worse for carbon and many other things as well. And we're going to go back to Mentimeter and ask you, how much worse is it? So let me just push on. So the question is here, the cotton bag is worse. How many times do you need to use the cotton bag so that it has a lower footprint than a plastic bag? So you've got one cotton bag and one plastic bag, and you've got to use the cotton bag quite a few times before you get to the point where it has a lower footprint, or the same or lower footprint than the plastic bag. Bearing in mind it's got the same volume. Okay, just give you another couple of seconds. 130 seems to be the winning number. Excellent, I'll pause that there. Yep, 130 is the right answer. You have to use a cotton bag on average 130 times before it has a footprint that is the same as or lower than the equivalent plastic bag. So plastic bags have come in for a lot of stick, and rightly so, because they get littered everywhere and they don't biodegrade and they look a mess. But cotton bags are far, far worse when it comes to carbon. And here are the numbers. So what I've highlighted in red there is an HDPE bag is essentially your standard carrier bag from a supermarket, and we're saying that there's no secondary reuse. You just use it once and then it goes in a cupboard under your stairs and you forget about it. The cotton bag is 130 times worse for carbon, and that's because of all the energy and inputs that go into making cotton, all the fertilizer, the pesticide to grow the cotton, to take the cotton and gin it into a fiber, produce it, and then turn it into a bag, and everything you need to do to it. You can see there's some other options there in terms of paper and bags for life as well. So the issue there was when they put the 5p tax on plastic bags in supermarkets, there was very much a call to say, well, that's great, but put a 5p tax on other bags, particularly paper bags, because otherwise retailers will just shift from one to the other and you haven't made any positive benefit. Add to the fact there that you might wash your cotton bag every so often if it gets dirty, if you use it to put your I don't know, your football boots in or something like that, and you increase impact. So it's not always straightforward. So if we ever get back to a situation where we go to conferences and exhibitions and someone hands out a goodie bag that's a cotton bag, just think about whether you actually want to take that cotton bag or not, because of this kind of thing. So it's not always straightforward, which is why carbon footprinting is a useful process to understand, well, what is the actual impact of these things and which one should I be thinking about if I have a choice? And as I said before, it's bringing that choice discussion more into line with carbon, as well as price, as well as availability, the time it takes to get it onto site, all those good things that we have to do anyway. Carbon should be part of that. So how do we know where to act? Data is important. That seems to be the word of the moment. It's data, not dates at the moment, and that's very important here as well. Timing couldn't have been better. What is a carbon footprint? There's no real kind of definition, but here we talk about it's commonly used to describe the total amount of carbon dioxide and other greenhouse gases and the emissions of those attributable to an organisation, a project or a product. Let's just break that down for a minute. So it's not just carbon dioxide, it's other greenhouse gases as well. So we talked earlier about methane, nitrous oxide, sulfur hexafluoride and some others. So it's all of those. They all have a greenhouse gas effect. They all exacerbate that situation. That very first picture where I showed you the picture of the Earth and the duvet around it of the atmosphere, they all contribute to that. You can do a footprint of your organisation, so your company, and generally you do that on an annual basis to say our annual footprint is X. You can look at it as a project. So if you're working on RDP for a few months to a few years, that is a project. You can put a boundary around that and say, for that project, our footprint has been X tons. Or if you manufacture a product that you sell on to a client, you can put a footprint on that. You can say this product required so much energy input and material input in its manufacture and distribution. Here's the footprint. All of these have a common system for calculating them. It's just how you apply them and how you use them. And it's this kind of thing that clients are increasingly asking their suppliers to produce as well as part of a tender process. What are you doing to reduce your carbon, and can you give us any information on the carbon footprint of your product or service or project or your organization? So there are various sources of carbon emissions from your organization. Clearly your own business, the stuff that you do every day, will give rise to carbon emissions. Here are some examples. If you directly consume a fossil fuel of some sort, you're causing carbon emissions. If you have gas or diesel and you're burning it, you're causing those carbon emissions in your boiler equipment, in your vehicles, in your plant, and so on. There's also a couple of extras in there that we need to be aware of. If you have a chemical or a biological process that can give rise to greenhouse gas emissions, that's important too. So, for example, in the cement manufacturing industry, the process of making conventional cement gives off CO2 emissions, as well as the energy that's used to do the calcination process. The biological process I mentioned already, digestion of organic matter, will give off carbon dioxide and methane and other emissions. Fugitive emissions are relevant where you have leaks, particularly from HVAC equipment. If you have equipment out there and on your estate, and someone comes and tops it up every so often with a bit more refrigerant, that means somewhere there's been a leak. Those are fugitive emissions. So the cold chain refrigeration distribution sector have to deal with that on a regular basis. Then there's your suppliers. Anything you buy or hire or a service that you get from your suppliers is part of your impact, because you are paying someone to provide a service for you. So you're not directly causing those emissions yourself, but someone is creating those emissions on your behalf, and you're paying for that service. So directly, the products and the services and the goods that you buy in, someone somewhere has manufactured them on your behalf, or they deliver them to you in a wagon or on a train somehow. But also the utilities you consume, the electricity that you buy off Npower, EDF, Centrica, whoever it happens to be. Likewise, waste services and water that you get from the local water company. And the one that most people are aware of is business travel. So again, it's a service. You're paying Virgin Trains or cross-country trains or whoever to provide a service for you. They're doing something on your behalf, you're paying for it. So that's part of your footprint, and that's where some of that your carbon comes from. But we shouldn't forget as well your client. If you, in the way that your supplier has provided something to you, you're providing something to your supplier. It's exactly the same. It's just flipping it around the other way. You're providing something onto your client, and that becomes part of their footprint. So what you're providing as your service or your product becomes part of what they're doing. So ultimately, if I was a client, I'd be saying, well, what are you as a supplier doing to help me reduce my footprint? Your service, the vehicles you use, the plant and equipment, the materials that you bring on site and their embodied carbon. What are you doing to help me reduce my footprint? And hence that's why the questions come out in tenders about carbon. So you can see it all flows through. Pretty much every organisation has suppliers and clients. So you'll fit in all those boxes at some point. But focusing on your business is the place to start. And just to reiterate some of those key phrases that we've been talking about, and it's good to know some of these because they're bandied about. They are jargon, but they are used so much that it's good to understand what they mean. The embodied carbon I've mentioned a couple of times is the energy that you would find locked away in a product or a material. The energy that's being consumed and the carbon emissions resulting from that, from manufacturing that concrete, that asphalt, that steel beam, whatever the thing is. In the infrastructure world, that's often known as capital carbon or CapCarb. Particularly from the infrastructure carbon review, it's referred to as capital carbon rather than the kind of the in-use phase. Your business, understandably, is operational carbon. What you use to drive your business forward on a day-to-day basis is operational carb, OpCarb. And then you might have, for your downstream client, end user carb. So you could imagine, for example, in a highway situation, the capital carbon or the embodied carbon is what goes into manufacturing those materials and components that are actually installed on the highways. The operational carbon is Highways England operating the gantries, for example, and the vehicles that go up and down that Highways England use on the roads. The end user carbon, in this sense, could be seen as the users of the highways, the people driving up and down the motorways, effectively. So there's various different groups within that. As I say, these are bits of jargon and bits of language that we need to know because people will use them on a regular basis, and they'll use them in the tendering process as well. One important piece of document that we need to be aware of is the greenhouse gas protocol. So I'm going to talk about standards a bit later, and this one is a protocol rather than a standard, but this is one that many organizations use to describe how they've developed their footprint. And this is about organizational footprinting. How do you describe how much carbon your organization emits on an annual basis? It's been around for a long time, and it's very well respected, and many organizations use it. And it shows you how to go about setting up a strategy, how to go about building a footprint of your organization, and what you can do about that in terms of options to reduce, how you can describe what you're doing in terms of your footprint to a third party. So I'm looking at the clock. I'm going to go for another probably 10 minutes or so, and then we'll take a break, allow you to go and get a drink, stretch your legs. I just want to go through a few key points here. This is something that's probably good to take away and think about as well a bit later, in terms of how it's relevant to your organization, but it's really important in terms of how you put together a footprint for what you're doing and for your business. So one of the key things we need to think about is, well, what do we include within our footprint? What are the boundaries that we say is inside, and that's what we're going to calculate, and as opposed to what's outside and we're not including? And the greenhouse gas protocol gives 3 key ways of doing that. There's the equity share approach, and then there's 2 control approaches, either financial or operational. And you can choose which one to do. There's no right or wrong, it's whatever's best for you, but you need to make sure you choose the one that's most suited for your organization, and then you stick to it, because then you need consistency. So the equity share approach, as the name suggests, is a way of accounting for greenhouse gas emissions from your operations according to your share in the operation. So how much you own, effectively. So it's your economic interest. This is very relevant for joint ventures. It's where you have a 50% share or 30% share in how the in the joint venture. Very useful in that situation. The oil and gas sector use it a lot as well, but increasingly in our sector we have more and more joint ventures, particularly on big infrastructure projects like Highways England and others out there, HS2 as well in particular. So equity share is all about your economic interest, how much you own, effectively. Financial control, again, does what it says on the tin. It's about a situation where a company accounts for 100% of the greenhouse gas emissions over which it has financial control. If you direct how the money is spent and where it's spent, you are therefore having an influence on the amount of greenhouse gas emissions. So therefore, if you take this approach, that's how you account for those emissions. Similarly, there's an operational control. Like financial control, this is about where you have control over how the operations are delivered. And if you take that approach, you account for the 100% of those emissions from that process. In most cases, most organizations, you'll have financial control and operational control. It's only when you get into the complicated world of joint ventures that things get a little bit more complicated. For most situations, you'll be saying, we own it, we have control over the finances, and we control the operation. So it's fairly straightforward, and you'll pick one of those, usually operational control. So this example here just to shows you, just illustrates the kind of the complexity of how it could be. This is a fake example derived from the greenhouse gas protocol. We've got a fictitious company called Construct Limited, and they've got 3 arms to their business. They've got a UK business called Construct UK, a German business, Aufbau, and then a French business as well. And This is here to illustrate how that operational financial control and equity share approach works, depending on which one you decide to take. So Construct UK is an incorporated company within Construct Limited, and it's totally owned 100% by Construct Limited, and they have 100% control financially and operationally. So it kind of makes no difference here which approach they take. But when they look at the German business, again, an incorporated business, but they only own 80%. 20% is owned by a kind of a sleeping partner. So if you take the equity share approach, you only account for 80% of the greenhouse gas emissions. But they have full operational and financial control. So again, this is where the difference starts to show, depending on which approach you take, as to how much of those carbon emissions, those greenhouse gas emissions, you account for. In the operational control, they would account for all of them, but in the equity share approach, they only account for 80%. And then below Aufbau, they've got a house building company called Hausbau, but they only own 75% of that. So again, the equity share approach drops again. 3/4 of 80% is 60%, so it's even less of the carbon emissions that they would account for. But the operational control, they still have full operational control. They would account for all of it. And then there's a different situation in the French subsidiary. So you can see how it can be quite complicated depending on how you run and own and control different subsidiaries of your business when you're putting together your footprint. So it's this kind of thought process that needs to be gone into depending on the complexity of your organization and how you gather that data. Like I say, there's no kind of right or wrong whether you take equity or operational or financial control, but you need to decide which is best for your organization. And that will be determined on, being fair in terms of what emissions you allocate, but also the ease of getting that data. That is a serious consideration if you can gather that data readily or not. So as I say, this is the kind of thing that's probably good to go away, sit in a darkened room with a stiff drink and have a think about it, because it takes a little bit of getting your head around. But it's once you've got your head around it, it's fairly systematic in terms of how you process what emissions that you are allocating. Okay, we'll take a pause in a few minutes. Operational boundaries. So we've just been talking about organizational boundaries. We're now talking about operational boundaries. Again, this is some of the key jargon that you should be coming away with from this. So as well as the embodied carbon, capital carbon, operational carbon piece, there's scope 1, 2, and 3. I'm sure you've probably heard about these in some shape or form, and it fits to the picture I showed you earlier with the arrows going up. And this is used all the time, this jargon of scope 1, 2, and 3. So if there's one thing I want you to come away from today with, it's probably the difference between scopes 1, 2, and 3. They simply are kind of descriptors or buckets for describing the emissions that organizations create. And it ties into the picture I showed you a few minutes ago. So scope 1 emissions are anything that you directly burn yourself. So direct emissions are from sources that you own or control yourself, the reporting company. So it's that boiler in the basement, it's the vehicles that you own, it's the plant and equipment that you run yourself on site. That's your scope 1 direct emissions. And those should be relatively easy to gather because you should have bills or something on a SAP system or Oracle or Enablon or one of those that talks about how much gas or oil or diesel that you've purchased, and you can get to the amounts that you've consumed. All the other emissions are indirect emissions, and this is what I was saying a few minutes ago, where someone else has done something on your behalf. They've produced a product or a material or a service on your behalf. As a consequence, greenhouse gas emissions have been emitted and you're paying for that product or service. So therefore, that's part of your footprint. Electricity is hived off particularly because it's so ubiquitous, and that's scope 2 emissions. So any electricity that you consume from your supplier is scope 2 emissions. It also includes if you buy heat from someone else, but generally in most cases it's electricity. That's your scope 2 indirect emissions. Everything else is scope 3. So scope 3 is where we put in the bucket your business travel. So like I said earlier, you pay GWR or LNER or one of those train companies for a train ticket. That's your scope 3 business travel. Similarly with planes and taxis. If you buy a waste removal service from a company such as Biffa or Veolia, that's your scope 3. Your water from Thames Water, Yorkshire Water, Severn Trent, that's your scope 3. The materials and products you buy from your suppliers, concrete, steel, asphalt. That's your scope 3 as well. That's the tougher one, because getting that data is harder because you don't have that direct ownership and control of that data. But it can be done. Many organizations are doing it, and increasingly that's the direction we're going. Organizations want to know what you're doing in your supply chain about your scope 3. And similarly, as I said earlier, there's the downstream bit as well to your clients, the scope 3 downstream. And a good example here would be, just to bring it back to home, is something like a washing machine. We've probably all got a washing machine in our homes. So imagine the manufacturer of that washing machine, a Hot Point or a Zanussi or a Neff, one of those. When they're in their factory manufacturing that washing machine for us, and they're using gas or diesel maybe to manufacture that washing machine, that's their scope 1. They're also using electricity, that's their scope 2. They will be buying in components from their suppliers and other materials, that's their scope 3. But when they sell that washing machine to us as householders and we plug it in at home and use it, and the electricity we consume, that's part of Bosch or Zanussi or Hot Point's scope 3 as well, because it's their downstream emissions. They have created a product and sold it to us as consumers. We plug it in and use it, and the electricity that's consumed in that is part of their scope 3 footprint. So they are also incentivized to make the machine as efficient as possible, because it's something that they talk about in terms of their impact. And something like a washing machine, most of the impact in terms of carbon is in its use. Once they've sold it and got rid of it, and it's there for 10, 15 years being used, that's where the biggest carbon impact is. So it's in their interest to think about that. Okay. I'm going to skip over that one. Some fundamentals. Global warming potentials. So I mentioned earlier there's those 6 gases, and they're not all the same. Some are worse than others. So this puts the numbers on it. So carbon dioxide has got an impact of 1. There are no units to this. It's just a way of comparing things with each other. So for every kilo of carbon dioxide, its impact is 1. But relative to that, methane has an impact of 25. It's 25 times worse. So essentially that's saying if you emit a kilo of methane from your anaerobic digester, that's the same as emitting 25 kilos of carbon dioxide. If you emit a kilo of nitrous oxide, that's the same as emitting almost 300 kilos of carbon dioxide. And that's why Starbucks was so hot on this. They wanted to change those squirty cans because they realized that there's a huge impact from a relatively small amount. And then you go to sulfur hexafluoride, and it's 1 kilo of sulfur hexafluoride is almost 23 tons of carbon dioxide. So any small leaks of that from some switchgear is going to cause issues. So you can see that not all gases are the same. It's a bit like a currency conversion, so like euros to pounds, dollars to pounds. How do you convert between them? You're not expected to know these numbers, but just be aware that there are global warming potential factors. And this is useful so we can compare things equally. So rather than saying, yeah, my organization emits 1,000 kilos of carbon dioxide and a couple of kilos of methane and a little bit of nitrous oxide, we use these numbers to convert them all into something called tons of carbon dioxide equivalent. So you'll often see reports where it says TCO2e. The E means equivalent. So we've converted all those dollars and yen and euro into pounds. So we know exactly what we're talking about. And then you can compare your organization to someone else's. You can compare your product to somebody else's or your project. And you've got that benchmarking, that replicability. You can understand how they compare. So as I say, you don't need to remember those numbers particularly, but understanding that they exist, and that's how you convert between them. And more than likely, the most common ones are the first 3, maybe sulfur hexafluoride in some cases, but more commonly it's the first 3. That kind of currency conversion between different gases. And this is what's really important to be aware of in terms of the impact that different things can have on climate change. This is very, dare I say, it's very Orwellian. Not everything is equivalent. Excuse me. So we talked about gases in particular, and this is relevant, as I say, if you've got nitrous oxide coming from some kind of water sewage treatment plant. Similarly with methane, if you've got any anaerobic digestion going on, but it's the same as well if you go into other products and services. So here are just some examples. The differences between different sources of power. So on the left, you've got 2 examples, one from grid electricity and one from red diesel. And for the same kilowatt hour of energy use, and I'll just reiterate, a kilowatt hour is just an amount of energy that is consumed. To produce that and consume that kilowatt hour of energy from the grid, you're looking at 0.288 kilos of carbon dioxide in the UK. Again, you don't need to remember these numbers. Sadly, I do, but you don't need to remember them. There are lots of lists where you can go and gather them. But if you get the same energy from red diesel, it's going to be a bit more expensive in terms of carbon. It's 316 grams compared to 288. So there are differences. Now, of course, you need to take into account, you know, in the world of highways, can you get a grid connection? It's not always viable. You're going to have to use diesel at some point. But if you can get a grid connection, then great, think about it, because it gives you security of supply. It means you get lower carbon emissions. You don't have the safety issues of someone having to top up a diesel generator, and you get local air quality benefits as well, because you're not consuming the fuel directly on site. So again, as I say, it's not just about carbon, it's about those other kind of next door effects and impacts as well. And the price, cost is there as well. Similarly with travel, there's a difference there. We talked about that earlier with the Menti question on traveling by train or plane. This just puts some numbers on that by traveling the same distance, whether it's by train, car or plane. And you know, the differences you can see in that, quite large differences. So having that kind of information to hand is useful. And it's the same kind of thought process when it comes to materials. This is about the embodied carbon that goes into manufacturing those materials. Again, not all materials are equivalent. And this comes down to how much energy is needed to extract, process and manufacture those materials and those products. So you can see at the lower end, you've got aggregate, which is relatively low. You know, someone somewhere has quarried up the stone, they've graded it to a right size, they've probably washed it. So there's some processing going on before it gets bagged and shipped, but it's relatively low. Whereas at the other end, you've got steel, which is, you know, 1.5 tons of carbon dioxide per ton of steel, because ultimately you've got to dig the ore out of the ground. You've got to go through some smelting process before you get to kind of basic iron and then to steel and so on, before you get to something like a box steel product. So they are huge variances in the impacts that you can see in those materials. And again, having this awareness is useful for when you're designing an asset or a product. You know, what are the carbon impacts as well as the cost of the material and the availability and the quality of the material? What are the carbon impacts as well? And I know Highways England will be very keen on looking at ways of reducing that embodied carbon, the cap carb, in the products and materials as well as their installation. So again, you don't need to remember these numbers. There's lots of databases out there that you can refer to, but having that knowledge and that awareness is really, really useful. Okay, so we're going to go to Menti for 5 questions. This is the last use of Menti. So if you get your phones, if you've logged out, there's the PIN code that you're going to need, 512663-3. And before the coffee break, we talked about some scopes, scope 1, scope 2 and scope 3. So we're going to do a little test. So I just need to press enter to make sure I hide those. So it's a simple question. You've got a 1 in 3 chance. What I want you to do over the next 5 questions is tell me which bucket these different consumptions of energy and emissions of greenhouse gas fall into. So the first one is your electricity in your offices. For this set of questions, we're assuming you have operational control. You have operational control of what you're doing, and that's the approach you're taking in your greenhouse gas protocol. So you consume electricity in your offices and on your estate. Which GHG scope do you report this as? Is it 1, 2 or 3? Okay, we've got 15 of you. So I've just seen, just while we're letting a few people answer the question, I've just seen Gigi ask the question, can we compare plane to car? And thankfully we have. That was like a yeah. Car is somewhere in the middle. Of course, it depends on how many people you put in the car as well. Car share will always reduce your per person carbon impact. Excellent. Okay, let's stop there. So 16, thank you very much. The answer is scope 2. So electricity is generally, in the vast majority of cases, you're paying somebody else to generate electricity for you. As I say, it comes from a power station somewhere, comes down the pylons, out of the plug socket and into your device. You're paying for it, you're causing it to be created, but you're not controlling how it's manufactured in effect. You know, what are they doing to create that electricity for you? That's your scope 2. You have no control over it. You can choose which provider you go to, consumer choice, but you can't tell npower how to go and make their energy, or SSE or any of those guys. You just have to take what they give you, or you go to another supplier. So that's scope 2. Okay, next one. Oh, hang on, I better hide this because otherwise you see the answer. You buy products and materials from your suppliers. Which GHG scope do you report that as? One, 2, or 3? Cool. So I think we had 16 last time. I'm going to show the correct answer. 17, excellent. So the correct answer is scope 3. Well done for the vast majority of you. Yeah, anything from your supply chain pretty much is scope 3. So your suppliers are providing you with materials. They will have manufactured and processed them somewhere. They will have consumed energy in doing so. You, in buying that material, that product, you've caused that energy to be used and those greenhouse gases to be emitted. So it's part of your scope 3, but you don't have direct control over it. So it goes into the scope 3 bucket, not your scope 1 bucket. Next question. You buy and consume fuel in your own fleet. You have operational control over the fleet. Which GHG scope do you report that as? And this is relevant to whether it's petrol, diesel, HVO, GTL, fairy dust, doesn't matter. Okay, we'll pause there. Yeah, scope 1, well done to pretty much everyone. That's scope 1. Because you have control over it, you've bought it off a provider, that's your scope 1 emissions. You've caused that to be burned effectively. So therefore you have control over it. So that's your scope 1. Probably a conversation for another day, but there are also other emissions. So the person you've bought that fuel from, they will have done some processing themselves. Ultimately, crude oil has to be processed into petrol and diesel. So there's some upstream emissions as well that are relevant to these fuels, and those are scope 3. But the actual fuel itself is scope 1. So that's what we need to focus on. Okay, so next one. Which scope does business travel fall into, such as by train or plane? So just while you're answering that, I'll answer Robert's question. Fuel is scope 1 because you're burning that yourself. You get gas off Centrica, British Gas, and you burn that in your boiler, or you put diesel into the car that you control, that you own, or the plant and equipment that you own, and you burn it. You are directly causing those greenhouse gas emissions yourself on your site. Electricity is being done on your behalf. It's the same as scope 3, but electricity is scope 2 because it's been done on your behalf. You haven't directly burnt that natural gas at Didcot Power Station or any other power station in the UK. Someone else has done that on your behalf, but you're responsible for it. Essentially, that's, it's part of your business. So you need to account for it, but rather than kind of lumping it all into the same thing, it becomes scope 2. Cool, great, thanks, Robert. Okay, so scope 3, yeah, business travel is scope 3. This is the most commonly reported scope 3 set of emissions, because most organisations can have access to their business travel. You'll have a travel agent, or you'll have an HR system or something somewhere that captures your business travel. If people book tickets, pay for tickets, that's captured somewhere, and you can manipulate that data to understand what your business travel emissions are. Other scope 3 is a bit harder, but generally business travel is the minimum you should be focusing on. Okay, I think this is the final question. You've got a chemical process in a factory that emits carbon dioxide as a byproduct. Which scope does that fall into? Cool. So that one is scope 1. So well done to most of you. This is the cement example. So if you're taking raw materials and you're doing the process to create cement, to manufacture cement, you're using energy as an input to make it hot. You have to make it really hot to make it work. So you're going to be using natural gas and maybe electricity. That's part of it. But the actual chemical process also gives off carbon dioxide as well as what the energy consumption is given as well. So it's an additional amount of carbon dioxide. You've caused it. It's in your factory, therefore it's your scope 1, and you need to report that. It's also relevant to aluminium manufacturers. They create greenhouse gases as well as the energy they use in the process of making aluminium products. So being accountable for that is relevant too. If you had an anaerobic digestion plant, a composting facility of some shape or form, and you were receiving materials and you were doing the process and kicking out greenhouse gases as part of that, that would be your scope 1 as well. So that's very much relevant for water companies. Cool. Okay. Excellent. Let me just switch screens. Wonderful. We can move on. Well done, everyone. So how to get a carbon footprint. We've talked about global warming potentials, so how you compare different gases. We've talked about emission factors. So these are the conversion factors to say, well, how much carbon dioxide does a ton of steel make compared to a ton of bricks? All of these are used to work out the footprint, and a carbon footprint is it's fundamentally quite easy. It's quite a simple thing. It's all about activity data and conversion factors. So activity data is a smart way of saying, well, how much stuff have you used? How many litres of fuel have you used? Or how many tons of that material have you used? And the emissions factor is those numbers you've seen before. It just converts that number of litres or that number of tons into carbon dioxide. So it'll be, as we saw earlier, it's so many kilos of carbon dioxide per ton. That's what a conversion factor is. So it's a bit like the currency conversion I was talking about earlier. And when you do that, you'll get something that comes out in kilos of CO2 equivalent or tons of CO2 equivalent. And it takes into account all those main greenhouse gases emitted. And that's the footprint. We're going to do some exercises in a minute. I'm going to get Steph to split you into some breakout rooms, 4 or 5 of you, where we're going to do some actual calculations. And when we do those, think about some of these key things here. Think about those emissions and those conversion factors. But also importantly, think about your units of measurement. Is it kilos or tons? There's 1,000-fold difference in that. Is it kilowatt hours or megawatt hours? There's 1,000-fold difference in those. So think about your units of measurement, because essentially you could get a very huge number or a very tiny number if you get them wrong. And also think about, sometimes in your activity data, you don't have a nice, neat situation where you know exactly how many litres that you've burnt or how many tons you've bought. You might only know how much money you've spent. And you're going to have to think, well, if I know how much money I've spent, does that mean I can work out how much stuff I've used as well? It's called proxy data. Can you work that out? So we're going to do a few exercises. I just want to show you a couple of things that you need to get up. You need to make sure you've got this to hand that Steph emailed you recently, excuse me. So this is the worksheet for the first exercise. And we've got a kind of pretend organization that has forklift trucks and so on. So you need that sheet. You also need this sheet, an Excel database with some numbers in it. If you remember earlier, I was saying you don't need to remember these numbers. Someone's provided them for you and you just need to refer to them. Excuse me a minute while I just cough. So this sheet gives us all those emission factors, those conversion factors. And just to give you an example here, natural gas, what this sheet is saying to you is that for every cubic meter of gas, natural gas that you consume and you burn, you emit just over 2 kilos of carbon dioxide equivalent. For every kilowatt hour gross of natural gas you use, it will emit 0.18387 kilos of carbon dioxide. So those are your conversion factors. So you get a choice depending on the units and how it's reported, or how you gather your data, or how your supplier provides that data to you. You know, they might provide it to you in cubic meters or cubic feet in the terms, you know, when it comes to gas, or in tons. And further down, you've got liquid fuels, solid fuels, gas fuels. There's lots of them, and this is just an extract from a database that DEFRA provides. And then down here at the bottom, you've got electricity as well. So here it's saying that for every kilowatt hour of UK grid electricity that we consume, on average, 0.233 kilos of carbon dioxide have been emitted in that kilowatt hour. And similarly, there's numbers here for water as well. So you need that sheet. So carbon reduction and making a footprint. We've talked a lot of things here about organizational boundaries, operational boundaries, scopes, embodied carbon, capital carbon, all this kind of stuff. If you're going to do a carbon footprint, there's kind of a process that you go through to think about what you're doing. And that's essentially what we've just done in the exercise we've just completed. We thought about what is within our control and what's within our boundaries and what we're going to do. So there's some key steps we need to do. You know, first of them is setting the goal. Why are we doing this? What's the purpose of what we're doing? And let's set the ambition and how much detail we're going to go to, and what kind of resources we need to actually achieve understanding what that carbon impact is. And when we've got that, we can then think about, well, what's the scope and the boundaries? What are the boundaries of our study? What are we including and what are we not including? So in the example before, we included our forklift trucks and we included our offices and our outsourced logistics, but we could have decided not to include some of the other aspects of what we do for good reason. As long as we make those assumptions and decisions clear for anyone else who's reading the footprint or studying it, then that's fine. Then we need to go out and gather some data, get that information, whether it's from our procurement colleagues or from our suppliers, or from, you know, other sources are available in terms of where we can get that information from, and pull it together in a reasonable format. Then we do the analysis, the calculation like we've just done. What does it all mean? And then we can check it against our KPIs. What are we actually trying to achieve? What are our targets? How does that influence our decision making in the future? Are we on track? And then there's a whole plan, do, check, act. Let's go back around that cycle again. So it's fairly straightforward. It's like any business planning procedure, really. What are we trying to achieve? What's within scope? What's the data? How does that determine how well we're doing? So we saw this earlier, this picture of where that information comes from, where those carbon emissions come from. And we talked about your direct footprint, the scope 1 emissions of what you buy and consume and burn yourself, the upstream scope 3 footprint from your suppliers, and scope 2 for electricity as well, and the embodied carbon within those materials and products. And then where relevant, the downstream scope 3 impacts as well from the products and the services that you sell on to your clients. So that's quite relevant. I mentioned the washing machine example earlier, but there's also good examples in construction. So for example, house builders, they have to be very aware of their downstream end user carbon. They manufacture, they build houses, that's their product. They then sell them to homeowners. Those homeowners use them for decades, ultimately. That's the downstream footprint. So they are incentivized to build houses that are efficient and insulated and don't lead to huge amounts of carbon. So thinking about where you set your boundaries, what are you going to include and what you're not going to include is really important within setting that footprint. And some of that will come down to what information you have available, and some of it will come down to what is reasonable to include as well. Is it significant? Is it reasonable to include that or not? And there's guidelines to help you do that, but there's no kind of right or wrong really in terms of what you do. So yes, we talk about, you know, primarily most organizations will include their scope 1 emissions and their scope 2 for electricity. As I was saying earlier, it's relatively straightforward to get that kind of information. Similarly, excuse me, similarly, business travel is normally relatively easy to get data for. And once you kind of progress and move beyond that, and you've kind of got comfortable with that, and you can evolve and make your footprinting more complex, you can then think about your supply chain, your scope 3. kind of the materials and products that you buy and you sell. So that was kind of for an organization. If you're looking at a product that you manufacture, it's a similar kind of mindset, but it's around the product itself that you produce and then sell to a client. And here you're talking about ultimately any product somewhere you've had to grow or extract some raw materials. Someone up the supply chain has done that on your behalf. Then they get those basic materials and they process them into a kind of a simple product or simple material that then gets manufactured and assembled into a more complicated product. And that requires energy, materials, water, and so on. So that could be your footprint up to the point of manufacture and the point of sale in effect. But it could also be the downstream use as well. And again, this is where the washing machines example comes in. It's a very good example of showing how that thinking about where the carbon impacts in the life cycle of that product could be. Because they use a lot of energy when they're in use. Lights as well, for example, where something like asphalt, once it's laid, you know, it's going to have some maintenance to it, of course, over its lifetime, but it's not directly consuming energy in and of itself. We could get into discussions about rolling resistance and tires and how efficient vehicles move over them, but that's kind of further down the conversation. So think about the product boundaries, what you're going to include and why you're including it, and then making those assumptions and statements clear to the outside world, why you've included storage and distribution or not, for example. You will have probably heard of some key phrases as well to describe what a footprint is: cradle to gate, cradle to site. These are shorthand phrases that just describe the boundaries I've just talked about. So if it's all those raw materials up to the point of manufacture and distribution out from your facilities, that'd be cradle to gate, or it could be up to site and then being constructed to the finished product. So the as complete design of that asset or that building. But then you might look beyond into the use phase and go cradle to grave to the end of that, the lifetime of that asset or that product, that building. And ultimately, if you're thinking in a more circular economy fashion, you know, what's the circular loop? You know, at some point that asset or that facility will be refurbished or remanufactured or even demolished and rebuilt in some other shape or form, and taking those materials back and putting them, recycling them through the circular economy. So understanding what those mean and how they can be used as descriptors is useful too. And it's a shorthand way of describing to a client or to a stakeholder what you're including in your footprint of your product or your service. So the data collection and analysis approach, if we start at the top at 12 o'clock and we're going to work our way around clockwise around this diagram. So if you essentially, this is setting your carbon reduction strategy. It's saying, well, what are our boundaries in the scope of the footprint? What are we going to include? Are we talking about our organization and the impact it has on a year by year basis? Are we talking about the product we manufacture and what the impact is of manufacturing that and shipping it and then installing it? So discuss those and agree what's in and what's not, essentially, and then that will then shape what kind of data you need to go and gather, who you need to speak to, who those key stakeholders are who own that data, and there are many different people who will be able to help you with this. So going off and gathering that data, building those relationships with your colleagues in procurement, building relationships with your suppliers who might have some of this data, finding other sources of information that are publicly available as well. Gather that information and always check it for its relevance and its accuracy. Is it potentially biased? Has it come from a trade federation that's got, you know, vested interests? Just think about those kinds of things, because it's important to not take it at face value. Is it relevant for your situation as well, or have you got some data that's from the US or from Australia that's not quite relevant to the UK? Think about those kinds of things. Then you do your analysis, you get your conversion factors, and we've used some of them already from DEFRA. There are many others out there, and I'll give you a sample of those later. Those bits of information that convert your litres of diesel or your kilos of steel into what the carbon dioxide equivalent is. Lots of databases. Some of them you have to pay for. They're proprietary, like everything in life, but some of them are for free as well. And then this is where it gets interesting. A carbon footprint in and of itself is kind of interesting, but it's just a number at the end of the day. And I'll give you a good example of that in a minute. The whole point is to take that information and identify the hotspots. Where are the key parts of your production process or the lifetime of an asset where most of the carbon is produced? Because it's that you want to focus on and bring down the carbon. It's the 80-20 rule. Focus on those big ticket areas, those hotspots. put plans in place to reduce that. Is it the steel that goes into the fabrication of the asset, or is it the transport to deliver the materials to site? Which are the biggest hotspots, and therefore which should you focus on? The example I have is of a humble bag of Walker's Crisps, cheese and onion flavoured crisps. They looked at the carbon footprint some time ago now on behalf of PepsiCo, who own Walker's Crisps, and they wanted to understand what the footprint was, and they came out with a number, and it was something like 35 grams of carbon dioxide per bag of crisps. So what? 35 grams, who cares? The interesting bit was they understood where the hotspots were in the life cycle of producing a bag of crisps. And two of the biggest areas were in the way potatoes are treated. So they had a procurement system with their supply chain that they would buy on the weight of the potatoes. Kind of makes sense. You know, it's a simple thing to do. How many kilos of potatoes are you buying, and we'll pay you per kilo. But the farmers were incentivized to pump the potatoes full of water to make them heavier. They could charge more money. Happy days. But then, of course, you get potatoes into the factory at Walker's Crisps, and they go, well, we can't fry these immediately because there's too much water in them. So we're going to have to dewater them. We're going to have to heat them to take the water out before we can then process them and do the frying to turn them into crisps. So those two unnecessary processes going on, a watering and then a dewatering process on either side, which is costing time, money, effort, and of course, carbon dioxide. They had this conversation and they realized this is not the way to go about it. We're all wasting a lot of effort on this, but those are the two hotspots for carbon that they can actively do something about. And there were other options as well, of course, in terms of how efficiently they fry the crisps. And they changed their business model. They decided to say, well, let's discuss it in a different way, and let's purchase in a different fashion. And that was all driven by the evidence that came out of doing a simple carbon footprint. So the actual final footprint itself was kind of not irrelevant, but less meaningful. It was the use of that data that was more important. Similarly, in the example that you guys calculated earlier, you'd look at that and say, well, what's our hotspot? It's probably not the forklift trucks. Let's focus on the electricity we use in our offices. Let's speak with our suppliers about the diesel they use in their vehicles. Can they do something with us? Could they switch to HVO, for example? That's the discussion that comes out of it. It's not the fact that you've got a number to 5 decimal places. It's what you do with that data is important. And then you can implement your action plans at about 7 o'clock here on the dial. You can implement your carbon action plans. You've now got to focus on who you're going to engage and why you're engaging them. And it's about reducing carbon, reducing cost, being more efficient, just generally in business. It's about business sustainability as well as environmental sustainability. And then you have your plan, do, check. How well did you do? What else could we do? What are the next steps that we can take? So I'm going to give you an example, a real life example of how this was done. Yes, this is trains, not roads, but the principles are very much the same. It's just that there's tracks rather than asphalt. And this was where carbon footprinting was used as a way of understanding which options would be most beneficial in designing a tunnel. So essentially, this is about putting a tunnel through the Chilterns for a well-known railway line that's going in relatively soon, if not now. And what are the options for putting in a tunnel about 1.5 miles long? They looked at 2 options, all around concrete and rebar and steel, but they looked at a box-shaped design, and they looked at a circular tunnel-shaped design, but also 2 different ways of installing it. One was all about cut and cover, so you dig a big trench, you pop in your concrete tunnel, and then you fill it back in. And the other option involved tunnel boring. Having a machine to bore a tunnel through the hillside and then install the concrete. And alongside all those other good things about how much time they're going to have on site, what the cost of it would be, what the safety implications might be, what the engineering reality is of those different designs, we also looked at carbon for them. It came out with, this was the overall impact. They looked at 4 options. I'm just going to focus on 2 of them, options 1 and 2. So option 1 is the square box cut and cover. So you have to dig out the whole trench and then put in the square box concrete. Option 2 is the semicircular concrete tunnel with some tunnel boring as well. And the 2 key things to focus on are those 2 massive peaks in the middle. And you can see there's the kind of the claret coloured one, option 1, and then the bluish coloured one is option 2. And there's big differences on concrete and reinforcement, steel rebar. And you can see that option 1 is higher for concrete in terms of the carbon footprint of it. The left-hand side talks about the amount of carbon emitted. The numbers we'll come on to in a minute, but it's just the relative amounts that are important for here. Concrete and steel reinforcement drive the carbon footprint overall, compared to some of the other smaller stuff like dewatering and backfilling and waterproof membranes that you can see that are lower down. But even within that, option 1 is still higher than option 2, particularly around reinforcement. You can see there that the blue bar is a lot lower than the claret red coloured bar for reinforcement, and that comes down to the design. The designers weren't inherently thinking about carbon when they did the designs, but from the bill of quants, we could work out what the carbon footprint was, and it helped drive the fact that they were just able to use less reinforcement and less concrete in option 2 than they were in option 1, and it was more efficient as well in some of the smaller things around excavation and backfilling. You know, if you're not having to cut and cover as much and you're just drilling it out as a tunnel, then you are more efficient. So here, this is a case of a bit like the Walker's crisps. You know, 92,000 tons of carbon, 125,000 tons. What does that mean? You know, they're just big numbers, but what does it actually mean? So we kind of quantified that in terms of what the reality is between those, and this helps drive that discussion using carbon as well as price and all the other good things we've talked about. So focusing on concrete, steel, and earthworks. How do you compare the two options you've got? So this is optioneering. Carbon saving we've already talked about, but in terms of the different processes, whether it's cut and cover or tunnelling, the tunnelling resulted in 1,000 fewer dump truck movements. And this is important not just for the direct consumption of the diesel in this case and the greenhouse gas emissions, but all those vehicles going up and down the roads, causing dust, community disruption. You know, you need access to areas, you need lay down areas as well, all those things that flow on from that. If you're moving less stuff using fewer vehicles, you can have lots of other benefits as well, not just the carbon benefit. So it's important to capture that at the same time. It's part of the story. Ultimately, they ended up realizing they needed to move over 2 million meter cubed less soil. So again, it's the lay down areas. It's what do you do with this stuff? Where do you, because you keep having to move it around in circles, essentially. It's double handling. So again, there's a lean thinking in there as well as the carbon emissions. In terms of the concrete, because it was a more efficient design but still stood up engineeringly, they worked out that that there was over 22,000 cubes of concrete less being needed because of the design. And that's all from the bill of quants and the design drawings that we were provided. We could work out that that was the value, and also what the financial value of that is. You're using less stuff, and these are based just on average prices that you find in the marketplace. I'm sure you can find it cheaper, but you know, we're talking a significant amount of money here. Similarly with steel, they were looking at a design that was more efficient for rebar, and you're looking at almost 9,000 tons of steel, and again, that's got a financial value saving. This is just purely using less stuff, costs less money, produces less carbon, reduce costs. It's a fairly clear follow through. So there's a financial imperative, financial argument here, as well as the other benefits of reduced air quality emissions if you've got fewer trucks going up and down roads, for example. But what does that carbon difference mean? So the difference was about 33,000 tons of carbon dioxide equivalent. And again, like I say, Walker's crisps, what does that actually mean? The information here that I'm showing you now kind of puts that into perspective. You know, these are not insignificant amounts of carbon dioxide if you put it in terms of the numbers of lorries driving up and down our roads, or the amount of energy required to power a town with grid electricity. So it's worth considering this along with financial implications, the amount of time you're on site. You know, clearly we want to be on site and off site as quickly as possible with as few safety incidents as we can. This can help some of that discussion, build it into that decision-making process. Okay, so just a few key things just to kind of reiterate that you've probably picked up as we've gone through. There's different data sources. You know, it's not always neatly presented as we used 100 litres of petrol. That's lovely. It doesn't, real world isn't always like that. So where you can get real data from a purchase ledger or meter readings, then great, grab it. But sometimes you're going to have to use proxy data, or you're going to have to estimate or get some sampled data from somewhere, depending on what you can get access to. You know, it's about relationships ultimately. Someone has that data somewhere, but how do you get hold of it? I did an example for Vodafone, and we worked out the carbon footprint of a TomTom sat-nav, and we wanted to help Vodafone understand what the benefit of having a sat-nav is for logistics drivers compared to not having a sat-nav. How much fuel do they save? How more efficient are they because they've got a sat-nav than they're not? We went to TomTom and their manufacturers and said, well, what's the bill of quants for a TomTom? You know, how much plastic, copper, cable, is in a TomTom? They got really confused. They thought we were asking them to calculate the carbon footprint of their product, and we'd been as clear as possible to say, no, just give us a bill of materials. We'll do all the calculations. So the relationships and the understanding, the clear messaging is really, really part of this. You're not trying to do one over on your suppliers. All you want is that real basic activity data. You can then do the processing yourself. You're not asking them to do all those tough calculations. Think about the quality of the data. Is it relevant to you? Is it up to date? You know, are you getting data from the 1990s that's just out of date? Is it, like I said earlier, data from the US or from France or somewhere that's not relevant to the UK situation? Is it reliable and unbiased? There are lots of examples where it is biased. You know, there's no reason why people wouldn't try to bias their data if it's going to give them more sales. So think about that as well, but also think about the amount of time you have. Don't go after every last nut and bolt. Think about the 80-20 rule. What are the big hitters? What are those hot spots? If you go after every last little thing, you'll drive yourself potty trying to get the data for it. And even when you do get the data, it could well be inaccurate. So just think about what's reasonable to get hold of. Do yourself a favor, basically. Think about the kind of conversion factors. So we were just talking about activity data, the liters, the tons, the kilowatt hours. Think about the conversion factors, where those have come from. Those need scrutiny just as much. Are those reliable? Are those up to date? Are those giving you what you need? So a lot of conversion factors are produced on an annual basis, but do check those as well, because those could equally be biased depending on who's produced them, or just not relevant to your situation. So do check them. Go in with, it's buyer beware. It's, just look at it like you would anything else from a supplier. I'm not expecting you to read that. Look at it later. Come back to it when you get the slides. But this is just a sample of some of the data sources you can use to get those emissions factors and other bits of information you might need. The two I'm just going to draw your attention to are the top two. DEFRA greenhouse gas emission factors that are published by the government every summer, June, July time every summer. They update all those emission factors. So that Excel spreadsheet you were using, that was a small extract of that database. It's a downloadable Excel spreadsheet. It contains all kinds of emission factors. It's wonderful. It's free. Most countries in the world use it because the UK has done lots of great work on updating the emission factors for fuels and materials and transport and all kinds of stuff. It's like a treasure trove. And then in terms of construction materials, there's the Bath University database, the ICE database. So most people talk about Bath ICE, it just trips off the tongue. Again, loads of great conversion factors on all the commonly used construction materials. What's the embodied carbon of plasterboard or a specific kind of concrete? That's in there. And then there's various other things that you can look at in terms of calculators and other bits of information. But those first two are probably the most predominant ones. They're free. Go ahead and use them. They were the ones that were used in that tunnel for HS2 example that I showed you earlier. There's a whole bunch of standards out there that you should be aware of. Again, you don't need to know them inside out, but being aware of them because they are good to use when a client asks you about them or when you want to put a tender response back to say, we calculated it according to the greenhouse gas protocol. That's one of the main ones. There's an ISO as standard equivalent that's got a long number that is similarly applicable, but a lot of people use the greenhouse gas protocol as the way of shaping how you do your organizational footprint. In the infrastructure sector, you might well have heard of PAS 2080. That's another standard that's available, aimed primarily at infrastructure, but is applicable to other sectors too. And that gives you the framework of how to do carbon management. It doesn't tell you how to set your boundaries. It doesn't tell you which data to use. It tells you about the governance procedures that you need, the stakeholder engagement that you need, setting a baseline, setting targets. It's those kinds of things about how you manage your carbon reduction strategy. Many organizations use this as their framework for how they're going to put that strategy in place and then manage down on their carbon.
James, apologies. Are we meant to be seeing the presentation just now, or you?
Oh, sorry. Am I not sharing? Thank you for saying. Sorry,
No.
I thought I'd been sharing. Apologies. Thank you for raising that.
No, no problem. No problem.
Let me just go back up a little bit then. Did you see that one?
No.
No.
Okay.
Just first time, yeah.
Sorry, apologies. This is, sorry, I'll just quickly recap very quickly then. There's this long list of sources of information. As I say, I was talking about DEFRA and Bath, those are the first two, but do have a look at this more closely when you get the slides. I talk through these, you don't need to see the pictures necessarily, PAS 2080. There's a couple of other standards that might be relevant to your sector in terms of assessing the sustainability impacts of construction. This is one of them, a British standard, 15978, very memorable number, that's available to put the framework in place of how you calculate your footprint and then report it to organisations. And similarly, there's one called 15804, which is about environmental product declarations. This is probably more important. This is about how you go about describing the footprint of a product. So if you provide products to a client and they say to you, have you got an environmental product declaration that talks about the impact of your product? And you say, yes, we have, and it was being calculated according to that standard. That will score you marks in a tender. It gives you the framework of how and why and yeah, how you pull together your footprint for your products. And there's similarly, there's a publicly available standard, PAS 2050, which again is about products, but this is more generic. This is kind of any product. It's not just focused on construction. But again, it gives you the framework of how you go about doing a footprint of a product and describing that to an end user. Okay, last couple of slides. Why is this important? Well, this is definitely business reality. This is an example from National Grid, who are very explicit in saying that carbon is part of their key ambition and drive, and that they are putting it into the tender process. They're including carbon more explicitly in how they score their tenders. And we've seen organisations, 5% is quite reasonable. We've seen some organisations putting 10, 20% in their tenders on sustainability and carbon issues. So it's becoming very much a business winning opportunity. It's not a nice to have anymore. Organisations are actively putting it in there. And this is one example that they did for a substation in London, thinking about carbon as part of that process, similar to the tunnel example I just gave you, and looking at those options through the lens of carbon as well. Carbon savings, financial savings are very clear to see there. They've been calculated, and it's their quote. We've been able to prove the business case that lower carbon can equal lower cost. Highways England are very much on the same page with that. So it is business reality, not just a nice to have or being sustainable. And then lastly, your carbon reduction strategy, and this is kind of where we finish, and this kind of would be a segue into the next stage about how you actually go about looking at your carbon emissions. And this is essentially in a nutshell what we've been talking about today. What's the scope of what we're doing? What are the boundaries? What are we including in our footprint, whether it's for our organisation or our project or product? We then need to go and measure it and gather that data, scrutinise it for its accuracy and its validity. Then we need to set a reduction plan. We know where the hotspots are. We know what the scale of the problem is and where those key issues are. How are we going to reduce them? Who are we going to engage with? What technologies are we going to buy and invest in to bring down our carbon emissions? It could all be in our supply chain. It could be with our fleet. It could be all of them. Then when we've thought about that and we've gone through that reduction process, we can think about investing in robust, valid carbon offsets as a kind of way of dealing with that residual leftover bit of carbon. And then go back around that cycle. And ultimately, you want to tell some people about it. You want to report it to your shareholders, your stakeholders, to your colleagues, importantly, as well as to your clients, through that tendering process. So that's a carbon reduction strategy in a nutshell. And having carbon footprint data at the core of that can drive that efficiently and effectively, rather than just kind of the old school of CSR of, oh, let's reduce it by 20%, because that sounds like a sensible number. So there we go. We're done. Thank you very much for your patience and your time. We're done with today, but hopefully that will set you on course for carbon reduction yourselves. I'm happy to hang on for a few minutes for any questions you might have. Other than that, please do the SurveyMonkey. I think, have you put that in the chat box, Steph?
Yes, I have.
Cool, thank you. So that's there. So thank you for your time. If you've got any questions either now or later, do send them through. And then the follow-up is for us to send you the slides and those worksheets. But other than that, have a good afternoon. Thank you very much.